My name is Melissa Stamell, and I'm the interim director of the Ethics Center, and I'm so honored to be here with you today. Today, my job is to introduce John Shattuck, who will be chairing this event. And we're so lucky because he is the chair of the Ethics Center Advisory Board. And he has served and dedicated his life to education and diplomacy and international justice. But I just want to highlight a few things about him. So John is a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And as I said, his career has spanned more than 4 decades in education, international diplomacy, foreign policy, and human rights. He has served as president of the Central European University from 2009 to 2016. And before coming to the Central European University, he was CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. John served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor under President Clinton, playing a major role in the establishment by the United Nations of the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. He helped negotiate the Dayton Peace Agreement and other efforts to end the war in Bosnia. Subsequently, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic, working with the Czech government to assist in overhauling the country's legal system, and with Czech educators to support innovative civic education programs. In recognition of his human rights leadership, he has received the International Human Rights Award from the United Nations Association of Boston, the Ambassador's Award from the American Bar Association's Central and East European Law Initiative, and the Tufts University Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award. Prior to his government service, he was vice president at Harvard University, taught at the Harvard Law School, and was a research associate at the Kennedy School of Government. His career began at the American Civil Liberties Union, where he served as executive director of the Washington office and has helped enact federal legislation to protect individual privacy and to enforce civil rights in the election process. We welcome John Shattuck, and he will take it from here and introduce our participants today. Thank you, and let's give John an applause.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you very much for that far too extensive but extremely warm and very nice introduction, which if you passed me the paper, I might have edited it somewhat by taking some out so our poor audience can get to the main event, which is what I'm here to introduce. This is really a very special event for me, and I think for virtually everybody here today. Bringing together, first of all, 2 remarkable figures in the field of international justice and human rights. You're going to hear a lot about Richard Goldstone tonight. Some of it may be in the form of a slight roast, if we say, because after all, a biography is by definition a little bit of a roast. But above all, let me say that Richard, whom I've known for many years and admired every one of the years that I've known him, is one of the world's leading voices for justice and human rights. And he has done this remarkable work at a time when justice and human rights have both advanced and been severely set back. And we're all living through those times. He knows how difficult that work is. I think Justice Brandeis, if he were pronouncing on this event, and in a sense he is, because after all it is his legacy that this university is dedicated to, would have said justice itself is a vast and complex and difficult field. International justice is even more vast by definition and more complex and even more difficult. So this is a remarkable road that Richard has gone down. And what we have from Dan Terris, I don't have a copy of it handy, but it will be available for everybody afterwards, is a remarkable biography that has been written about Richard. And Dan, of course, is the founder and 20-year leader of the Center on Ethics, Justice, and Public Life here at Brandeis. Richard is my immediate predecessor as chair of the center, so I sit here in awe of my two betters in this context because they've done so much work in this field. The struggle for justice is where Richard Goldstone chosen to live his life. And it is that life that is the subject of Dan's remarkable new book. I've been privileged to know Richard, as I said earlier, for many years. At one point, I played a small part in his selection as the first chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is one of the great achievements of international justice in recent years, in that it overcame a long-standing gridlock on that issue after the Nuremberg tribunals had done their work, and then was launched in 1993. But the legacy of the Cold War was still, to some extent, very much alive. And as I was then the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and I had been involved in setting up and drafting the legislation to establish, the international legislation to establish the tribunal, and we were looking for a prosecutor. You can't go anywhere with an international tribunal unless you have someone to do all the work and to do the leading work in identifying those who've committed war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. But the gridlock manifested itself in the Security Council of the United Nations, and it was difficult to reach an agreement about who should be the prosecutor. And at one point I had a meeting in Moscow with a person who's gone on to much more fame than I. I'm not sure I would want to be in his shoes. Sergei Lavrov, who is currently the foreign minister of the Russian Federation. And Sergei Lavrov and I each had a list. We had a list of names, I representing the United States, and he had a list of names representing Russia, of people who should be considered for this tribunal to break the gridlock. And remarkably, we discovered within moments of our meeting that the man at the top of both lists was Richard Goldstone, the US list and the Russian list. So I think in some ways that's emblematic of your entire career, that you've managed to bridge so many gaps in so many different ways. But in this case, it was a very practical and very urgent one. You're going to hear much more about Richard. There are many chapters in his life that Dan is very ably and incisively and very constructively put forward in his book. But three in particular: his life as a lawyer and judge in South Africa, who played a major role in the transition from apartheid to the restoration of civil rights by leading a fact-finding commission on political violence in one of the most difficult situations of the outbreak, again, from time to time, of political violence, as Nelson Mandela was being released from prison, and nobody knew quite where the future of South Africa was. And the Goldstone Commission, which did its work, was another remarkable bridge between the apartheid regime and the new world of Nelson Mandela. And then I've mentioned his work as one of the founding fathers of modern international justice and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And then a third chapter, even in some ways the most difficult and complex of all, which is he was a major fact finder for the United Nations, looking into some of the most difficult, controversial, and uncertain international issues of our time. The NATO intervention in Kosovo, the UN oil and food program in Iraq, which ended up where there was some difficulties involving the UN Secretary General, and his son, which had to be investigated by Richard. And then finally, the alleged war crimes that were committed during the conflict in Gaza. And during all of these times in his life, Richard has behaved with great equanimity and a great and deeply committed sense of justice. And I don't think anybody with a weaker constitution could have gone through these controversies. But anybody with a less wonderful partner than Nolene Goldstone, who is here with us today, could not have gone through with this. So a special thanks from me to you, Nolene, for all that you've done over these years. Just a few very short words of introduction about the author of this remarkable biography, Dan Terris. I think everybody here knows Dan. I've been privileged to work with Dan and know him also for many years. First, when I was at the Kennedy Library, he was one of my advisors when I was trying to bring Palestinian journalists and Israeli journalists together in the United States in the Kennedy Library in the early 2000s. And then when he was developing the remarkable mission and agenda of the Center on Ethics. Dan is a distinguished intellectual historian who's written on race and ethnicity extensively, on public ethics and on international law and justice. At Brandeis, he was an innovative leader and academic entrepreneur who oversaw the creation of many of the university's signature international programs: the Brandeis Institute for International Judges, the Brandeis Genesis Institute for Russian Jewry, the Brandeis Master's Program in Coexistence and Conflict, and above all, the Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life. So your legacy here at Brandeis is very large, and all of us are grateful for it. And now you are off to new horizons as the Dean of the Al-Quds Bard College of Arts and Sciences in Jerusalem. So enough from me. Now to the conversation that you've all come to hear between Richard and Dan. I turn things over to both of them. They will take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And just one last point, logistical. At the end of the discussion, Richard and Dan will both be, I think, in the back of the room where there are books available for signature and purchase, and there they are. That's a plug for this book, which I have read every word of, and it's a terrific book.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John. What Richard and I have agreed to do is that I'll start by talking a little about how I came to write the book and some of my thinking about why this life of this extraordinary individual also tells a larger story of our time. Richard will get to speak about what it's like to be the subject of a biography, and we'll go a little back and forth on that process of biographer and subject. This is going to be our only chance to have this conversation in public. I'll be doing some other book talks, but without Richard. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say, maybe as much as some of you. And then, as time permits, maybe I'll read some short passages and let Richard respond about his impressions of what I got right and what I didn't in trying to capture his extraordinary life. I'm very grateful to John Shattuck. Thank you for that generous introduction of both of us. I just checked the index. John is mentioned 5 times over the course of the book, so he was too modest about the important part he played in a number of the key incidents in Richard's life and the historical developments of which Richard was a part. And of course, it's very special to be here in this room where I've had so many great events at Brandeis with so many people from this university and from the surrounding community who have been part of my life for so many years, and many people in this room who also contributed directly and indirectly to this book through your encouragement, through your research, through your support. And so, no book like this gets done without a large community of people who help make it possible. And those here in this room and those beyond, I'm extremely grateful to many of you. and have tried to thank you in as many ways as I can. So Richard, let me take us back a few years to, I think the work on this book started in about 2011. I think you and I first discussed this. And 2011 was just the time where maybe the peak of the intensity of the aftermath of the Goldstone report on Gaza was maybe finally just beginning to subside. In 2009, you had chaired a four-person mission under the auspices of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Human Rights Council to inquire into the possibility of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza Strip during what the Israelis called Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009. And that report, which came out in September of 2009, had extensive and careful documentation of what had happened in Gaza, and came to the conclusion that there was very good reason to think that war crimes had been committed, both by the authorities in Gaza, the Hamas authorities there, and also by the Israelis. And the report was very detailed, very meticulous in the way that's characterized your work as a judge and your work as an investigator in so many other situations. But its conclusions were also very strong and spoke to consequences, legal consequences for the authorities that in particular incurred the wrath of many in the Jewish world, both within Israel and all over the world. And that controversy, which both attacked the report but also turned into an attack on your integrity personally, was an all-consuming event for a couple of years of your life, and in which we here at Brandeis had played a small part. You, of course, had been a member of our community since before 2000, since the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life started. You were a founding member of our board. At the time of the Gaza report, you were the chair of the board of our center, and so you were very much a beloved and essential part of our community here. And so we took the events after the Gaza report personally on your behalf, but also as a challenge to our whole community to think about how we could kind of restore a spirit of reasoned disagreement, reasoned conversation about the important issues of law and justice in a climate where so much anger was directed and misdirected. And so in the aftermath of that, first I was disturbed that the stories about that Gaza report, as reported and its aftermath, were almost entirely characterized in a polemical way. Almost every account was an ideological account, either many of them attacking you and the report in very strong terms on the basis of its critique of Israel, or sometimes ideological in favor. But in any case, the complicated issues, and John referred to the complexity of issues of law and justice in an international setting, the complexity of those issues was almost entirely lost in that angry and bitter discourse of the time. And so as someone who'd been involved in your life and work for a long time, but also as someone involved in this center that took it as its mission to try to bring some kind of clarity and reasoned discussion to emotional and difficult issues, I felt some kind of obligation to try to begin to tell your story and that story in a way that would get beyond the discourse that had happened over the previous 2 years. But I found almost immediately in thinking about it that there really wasn't any way to separate the story of Gaza from the larger story of your own life and in a way, the life of what's happened with international human rights and international justice over the last 30 years. This was not an event that happened in and by itself. It's part of a larger story of which you are perhaps the single most important figure on the world stage. In how do we take these ideals of human rights and accountability for crimes committed on a massive scale, and how do we actually implement them? How do we make the accountability a reality? How do we make international justice something tangible, as opposed to just an abstract set of things on the books that people may or may not have any real faith in? And your life and career were really the enactment of this. And I really began to realize that not only were you an individual whose story needed to be told, but you were at the center of these important currents. And the three narratives that John's already briefly outlined, each of them told a somewhat different but related story. So first, your part in the transition to democracy in South Africa grew out of your own commitments to the law as a judge and your own lifelong antipathy to apartheid and oppression and all that it stood for. You chose as a young man to follow the law and to find a way to create change in an oppressive system from the inside. After working as a commercial lawyer, you agreed to become a judge within the South African system on the Supreme Court there. And then following 10 distinguished years there, you were tapped by both F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela, newly released from prison, to lead the commission that John referred to that was the first official kind of account of the roots of violence in South Africa, and particularly important investigations that uncovered in a public and formal way the abuses of the security forces within the South African regime. But what was important about that story was, to me, was not just the seminal role you played in the transition to democracy, but the way in which faith in the rule of law played an important part in allowing South Africa to go from a hugely oppressive regime into an imperfect democracy, but where law remained at the center. So the faith in the law, not only of people like yourself who worked from the inside, but also of those who represented the African National Congress, and Mandela and Tambo themselves, of course, lawyers. The work on the South African Constitution, and your life, the way in which you showed that legal structures could themselves be preserved and used to combat tyranny and oppression from inside, that itself was a crucial story. And if we have time, we'll talk about one or two of those specific instances in which you did that. The second story, again, John talked about. International criminal justice, an idea enacted to some extent in the Nuremberg trials after World War II, finally came to life in a tangible form in the early 1990s in response to the massive tragedies in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. And John mentioned the establishment of those two tribunals under the auspices of the United Nations, your appointment as the first prosecutor of those tribunals. Those tribunals have completed their work after 20 extraordinary years. They had their ups and downs, they had their critics, they had their problems, but I think no one can doubt that in many ways they have been able to bring a kind of accountability that really very few people thought was possible in the 1990s. They brought to justice the political and military leaders of both of those tragedies. They established important legal principles that you played a part in, like establishing the idea that rape can and be considered a war crime in legal terms. And so those tribunals now, which we now in some ways take for granted, were very fragile institutions in their early years. And the story that I wanted to tell of your life was the way in which you worked so cleverly at the intersection of law and politics to be able to preserve institutions that almost as soon as they were created, many of their creators wanted to shut down. This is a story John knows very well. Many of the Western powers created these institutions and then started getting nervous about what their implications were. Where might international criminal justice go next once established? What obligations did it confer on the great powers? And so almost as soon as they were created, Richard had to identify friends of the tribunals, people like John, and well-placed people in other places who could help preserve the tribunals in this area of power politics. And so I wanted to tell that story, which complicates the notion of how justice and politics work together. And you were a master at that intersection. And finally, I wanted to tell, as I said from the beginning, the story of the Gaza report itself. And there, what I really wanted to emphasize was not just the facts of the report, but also to try to bring to light the complexities of what it means to try to bring justice into your own house, into your own community. You obviously took on this report in part because of your longstanding attachment to the State of Israel, your commitments as a Jewish person, and your sense that if justice were to mean anything in the world, we had to be willing to think about it in terms of our own community, our own house, our own people, our own attachments, not just in some distant place. That's hard to do, as you found out. It's hard to do in many different circumstances. And so I've tried to tell that story in a way that tries to lift up the challenges of that particular circumstance. So those were the stories I wanted to tell. And then I faced from the beginning the challenge of how we were going to work together, how I was going to do the research to make the book and your life come to life. I remember once I heard speak a well-known biographer of books for children, biographies for children, named Jean Fritz. And somebody asked Jean Fritz, have you ever done a biography of somebody who's living? And she thought about it for a moment, and she said, oh, heavens no. She said, I prefer my subjects good and dead. Now, I didn't prefer that in this case, nor did I have a choice. But I knew what she was saying. That is to say, when your subject is not there to look over your shoulder and give you critiques, you can take certain liberties with the material. You can work with the documentary evidence. You don't have to worry about what he or she might think. You can take some liberties and imagine what he or she might have been thinking in some situation without worrying that anybody's around to disrupt it. So I didn't have that liberty in this case. But what I did have was the privilege of being able to speak with you. And you made yourself generously available for hours in locations all over the world. And we agreed from the beginning about how we would think about this book. You, of course, wrote your own eloquent autobiography of sorts that you published in the late 90s, shortly after your work in The Hague. But we agreed from the beginning that this would be different. This would be your story, but my book. That I would do the research, you would help me with it, but that I would have to come to my own conclusions based on whatever I found as a historian, that I had to do my job as a historian, I like to think, in some of the same ways that you had done your work as a judge. Of course, you bring certain predispositions and values and ideals to it, just as I brought from the beginning a sense of admiration for what you have achieved. But at the same time, it was going to be my obligation to try to follow and draw my own conclusions about the material. And you generously agreed to this compact, trusted me with your story, opened yourself to, as I say, many hours of interviews, let me paw through the boxes and boxes of your personal papers in your apartment in Johannesburg, allowing me to unearth all kinds of fascinating material. You encouraged others in your family and circle of friends to help me out, so I had a lot of valuable help from Nolene. Your brother David spent hours scanning old newspaper articles from his collection that would otherwise have been inaccessible to me. So I had a whole community helping me with that story, all with the trust that I would tell the story in a way that was as honest and true as I could make it. And we agreed that at the end of the process, not before, I would share the manuscript with you so that you could correct errors of fact. And we went through that process a year ago where I shared it with you, and you corrected some mistakes I'm very glad are not there. All the ones that are there are my own fault. And then we went back and forth a bit on some matters of interpretation, some of which I changed that you persuaded me, and others of which I said, no, I think this is the way that I should leave it. So that was a process that for me was valuable but challenging, because we've spent so much time together as friends and colleagues in the years before, and yet I still had a kind of professional obligation to try to tell this story in as candid a way as I could. So with that by way of introduction, maybe you can talk about how it felt to be the subject of this and what you went through as I worked on the research and as you came to know the manuscript later.
Well, firstly, John, thank you very much for being here and for chairing the session, and thank you very much for your contributions to my career. It's amazing how our lives have crisscrossed in the various positions, important positions you've held, and in many countries. In fact, I remember doing a joint fundraising event for the Rwanda Tribunal, one of many issues on which we've worked very well together, and I've always appreciated very much your support and encouragement and the support you've managed to get from your government from time to time, which might not have been forthcoming without your efforts. Let me say, too, that Brandeis has played a special role in my life, and mainly because of the friendship I built with Dan. What Dan hasn't mentioned is perhaps it's worth mentioning is the Brandeis Institutes for International Judges, which is really quite remarkable. John knows a lot about that, but there have been how many? 12 institutes over nearly 20 years, where Brandeis has brought together international judges, only judges from international and transnational courts, to meet once every 18 months together behind closed doors, Chatham House rules, confidentiality, and giving these judges the unique opportunity of meeting each other. They never, ever were able to meet and aren't able to meet outside these Brandeis Institutes, strange as it may seem. And this has been a major contribution, which has been acknowledged by judges from maybe 14, 15 international and transnational courts. And the Ethics Center is and can be very proud of that, and the role that Lee Swigert has played in organizing these institutes has been remarkable. With that introduction, let me answer Dan's question. What is it like to be I'm not sure if it's the subject of the book or the object of the book. but let me say I can sum it up in 2 words. Very weird. It's a very weird experience to read about your own life through somebody else's eyes. And as Dan mentioned in his eloquent acknowledgements at the end of the book, we agreed, I think, on the big picture issues. We didn't really have any, and we had hours, as Dan said, hours of discussions about it. But on the big picture issues, we were really on the same page. We disagreed on some smaller nuances, interpretations of events, and Dan's written his book. Not the way that I would have written a book, and let me say that I would hate to ever have to write really a full autobiography. I think it's very difficult, much easier to write about somebody else than about yourself. And Dan's story about the biographer who said it's easier to write about people after they've died. It brought to mind an episode a few months ago. Our President Cyril Ramaphosa appointed a number of commissions into corruption and so-called state capture in our country. And one of the people he appointed on one of the inquiries, just the latest report, damning former President Zuma and some of his ministers for terrible corruption. But the investigator is a former Minister of Police, a man called Sidney Mufamadi, who I knew. He was in Mandela's original cabinet, and I worked with him during my commission before Mandela became the first democratic president. But Mufamadi called me one evening and asked me about a certain South African policeman who had worked for my commission. He'd been seconded with other police officers to work with my commission. And halfway through the commission, he came to me one day literally with tears in his eyes. He was a strapping police colonel in the apartheid police. And he said, "Judge, I'm going to have to stop working for you." He said, "I've been a double agent." He said, "I've been reporting to the South African Police Commission on what you're doing. And I believe in what you're doing, and I can't continue doing it." And Sidney Mufamadi asked me about Hessling, and I told him the story because he's still in the police force. And Mufamadi thanked me, and a few weeks later he said, if you're home this evening, I'm being interviewed on the television, and you might want to listen because I'll be referring to you. And he referred to this police officer and said that he got the information from Judge Goldstone, and he said, "If you don't believe me, you can speak to him, he's still alive." Which made my mortality feel very, 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 very present. And it's in that sort of way that I felt the first time I read the manuscript Dan sent me, which was a longer one than is in the book. It was very, very strange reading about oneself and one's own life and about one's friends and what one's friends said about me. Things that I wouldn't have anticipated. And so it was a very, very unusual experience. I think the best praise for Dan's book is the fact that I enjoyed reading it, my wife enjoyed reading it, my daughters and sons-in-law have enjoyed reading it, and my grandchildren have enjoyed reading it, which I think says a lot about a book which is in some ways critical. It's certainly, I can't tell you how many people who have read it have said they enjoyed it because it wasn't hagiographic. And that, I think, is to Dan's credit and makes the book more important in many ways. The other outstanding feature of the book, certainly that I and others have found, is the way Dan has balanced the issues that he's written about, but in particular the historical background he's given as a historian, the background of racism in South Africa, the complex background of the Balkans, the relationships between Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, which a lot of people don't understand, and Dan's given them a wonderful ability to see that, and also the history of Gaza, which is little known to many people who are not experts in the area. So Dan, thank you for writing the book. It's been a pleasure collaborating with it. One thing was essential to this whole endeavor, and that was my absolute trust in Dan's integrity and his judgment. I don't know anybody else in the world I would have given my documents to without knowing what I was giving you. I didn't leave out, I didn't go through them. And Dan may talk about one of the documents he found there, which I didn't know I had. So let me leave it at that.
I'll talk about that document in a minute. But first, now that you've said all the nice things, tell me one thing that you think I got wrong. Tell me something, or not wrong, that you would have told a different way. Is there some story, some aspect, something that you would have shaded in a different way than it came out?
Well, I learned things from it. I mean, let me go back to my days at university, where we found, you'll read about the blonde spy, who was a student at Witwatersrand University, who was being paid to give information to the security police about the work we were doing on the students' anti-apartheid organization. And we got the information about her by this girl's best friend, who was dating the president of the Students' Council. I was then the deputy president of the Students' Council. And we lured her under false pretenses to the apartment of a leading member of the Johannesburg Bar, Ernie Wenzel, who was a very activist in the anti-apartheid world. And she came there, and Ernie Wenzel, and we'd hidden a tape recorder in those old-fashioned days with the big reels. We'd hidden that behind a plant, and we recorded Ernie Wenzel questioning her and John Shingler, who was the president of the SRC. And I don't think I said very much. Dan's listened to the actual recording.
I found the transcript that was typed. There was an actual
Dan
transcript
found a
in the.
transcript
I didn't have the actual real tape.
Yeah.
But I found the transcript in the archives of the University of Witwatersrand.
If you read that, one of the early chapters, Dan is a little critical of the way we treated this girl, that we abused her rights. We didn't offer her an attorney. We didn't respect the rule of law, and that shook me because we never considered those issues. Here was a woman student who was accepting money from the security police to report on a friend. It was a real Mata Hari story. And yet Dan took the point. He said the point he made was that the rule of law standards which I espoused and supported were not really consistent with the way we treated Priscilla Lefson. It was that sort of weird experience that one comes across. That stands out, I think.
I think, yeah, what I said was, by the standards of fair procedure and human rights that Goldstone later stood for, the Inquisitor's methods were, after all, somewhat excessive. If Goldstone and Shingler were so concerned about civil liberties and underhanded tactics, then what about their own actions in making a secret tape recording and then hastily making it public? 3 men had lured a vulnerable young woman under false pretenses to an apartment and then ganged up to interrogate her for 2 hours.
I wouldn't have written that.
There was another woman in the apartment, by the way. They weren't by themselves. Threatening her with public exposure if she did not make a full confession. So, but then I go on to say that Goldstone's excesses were understandable in the context of a country in the grip of a racist and increasingly authoritarian
I'm just tell you one incident that isn't in the book, and I didn't talk about it for decades. when we decided to give the story about the spy to the main Sunday newspaper in South Africa, the Sunday Times, and leading editor at that time, Joel Mervis, and we took him the story, and he said this will be right across the front page on Sunday. And I said to John Shingler, I think we should tell the president of the university, the vice chancellor, as we called him, Professor Sutton, what to expect on Sunday. And John Shingler said, I'm not going to speak to that so-and-so. But he said, but I insisted. And he said, well, I'll come with you, but you can tell him. So we went to the office of the vice chancellor, and I said to him that the story was coming out about a student who was accepting in those days £15 a month from the security police. He said, oh, who was she dealing with on the security police? So I said, a Sergeant Kruger. He said, oh, Kruger. He said, I've been giving him information about students for years.
So while we're on South Africa and on documents, and this was, of course, one of the joys of, as anybody knows, of doing this kind of research is you just turn up all kinds of unexpected things. And I did find, do you mind if I bring this? Yeah, this is, so I found in Richard's papers a letter that he knew was there. And originally I'd hoped to actually quote in full in the book, but then ended up not being able to just for reasons of space. But it turned out to be one of these documents that sheds light not only on the era, on an important figure in the era, but also on Richard and his kind of family life at the time. And so this is a letter that was in his files, a copy of a letter from Nelson Mandela to Richard and Nolene's younger daughter, Nikki, who was at the time living in Israel. She'd moved from South Africa to Israel, where she had gotten passionately attached to Israel and its future. But this was 1993, and South Africa was on the cusp of change, and she felt a kind of draw and obligation, should I be coming back to South Africa to help our country, help the country I grew up in. So she was feeling this conflicting thing. On the one hand, feeling very drawn to staying in South Africa. On the other hand, should she come back? And she didn't know what to do. And she was conflicted, and so she actually wrote a letter to Nelson Mandela, which I guess you must have helped get into Mandela's hands. He was at the time the chair of the African National Congress, not yet the president. This is 1993. And Mandela writes her back. And this is what he says on African National Congress letterhead, August 4th, 1993. Dear Nicole, I am very sorry it's taken me such a long time to respond to your letter, but I don't need to tell you that my workload is immense. Furthermore, I wanted to give more considered thought to your problems before replying. There are many of our children, particularly those of our white comrades, who, like yourself, feel torn between their land of origin and the land of their adoption, whether this be through faith, exile, or education. My own children, to a lesser or larger degree, have suffered tremendously from the destruction and disruption of their family life. The underlying cause is, of course, apartheid. Now, apartheid is not your individual responsibility, and you were far too young to have been a part of it. There is really no need for you to feel the guilt of your elders or to take responsibility for it. You certainly do not need to apologize for being white. The fact that you have a father, a well-respected and prominent person in South African politics today, is, I agree, going to be a label you will have to bear throughout your life. This is unfortunately not a problem that I or anyone else can solve for you, except to say, very strongly indeed, that you are your own very special person and you have your own very special life to lead. Be proud of your father's reputation, but do not let it cower you. Wear your name with pride, as you have the right to do so. You have asked me to do a very difficult thing, to give you, quote, permission to leave South Africa. We, your father and I, and many others, have not only fought the evils of apartheid for ourselves all these years, we have done it for our children and our children's children. We have done it not only for South Africa, but for all mankind. Apartheid can be called by other names, as you know, and wherever it is found, it should be eradicated. I have appealed to white South Africans not to leave simply because we need their expertise and knowledge to help build a new South Africa out of the ashes of apartheid, a kind of gesture to Richard's own having stayed. It is one way where South Africans can reconcile their past with a new present and future to show that they wish to make amends. As to your choice of Israel as a second home, I cannot really comment, but suffice it to say that it is unfortunate that the State of Israel has sought to impose its own form of apartheid, and that Zionism in its purest form has been distorted by those politicians bent on their agenda. Israel's links with apartheid South Africa are well documented. It is not really for me to give you permission to leave South Africa. We would like all the young people of South Africa, particularly of a caliber such as yours, to help us heal the wounds of our past and rebuild a country of which we can all feel proud to call our own. But if you are to remain in South Africa feeling unhappy and not being able to give your all, as we will all have to do if we are to achieve our dreams, then you must find a niche for yourself where you will be happy and where you can contribute your best. I would like to have thought you could do this here in South Africa, but if it is not to be, then so be it. My only wish is that you are happy. Very sincerely, Nelson R. Mandela, President. Clearly a letter that Mr. Mandela wrote himself and from the heart, and also a kind, not only an amazing document in his response to Nikki, but also a kind of sense of shared vision for what it means with Richard and what he's done. This is the kind of thing that makes the work of a biographer kind of special, to find a document like that captures so much about a person and so much about an era. I think we probably should take some questions. There's plenty more I'd love to say about you and your work, but there may be others who want to call our attention to specific things about the process of biography or about your life and work, or whatever we can do. So there's a mic at the back, and please.
Thank you.
Doron, identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Doron Shapir. I'm a graduate student here at the university. I'm from Israel. A bit shocked, actually, by the letter, that I think it's beautiful, but I can't agree with everything that it said. And that's actually why I came. Growing up in Israel, I heard your name in so many negative, connotations, and I want to hear your side about how Israeli government, Israeli people have treated you while you were doing your important work on what happened in 2009, and what do you recommend for Israeli policymakers to do looking forward with anything that has to do with international investigation and so on? Thank you.
Well, that's such a broad question. Let me internalize it a little bit. I think certainly I can't generalize, and it's not for me to give advice to the government or the Prime Minister of Israel. But let me say one of the deep regrets I have in relation to the Gaza investigation was that we didn't have the cooperation of the government of Israel and of the Israel Defense Force. The whole process of the investigation and the report would have been very different. And I understand the Israeli objection to its obviously unfair treatment over years, over decades, by the United Nations. If I was an Israeli, I don't think I would put much trust in the integrity of certain organs, and particularly the Human Rights Council and now the Human Rights Commission. But having said that, one of my hopes in becoming involved with that investigation was that my being involved and having regard to my history of support for Israel and involvement with the Hebrew University and other Israeli institutions, that the Israeli government would have cooperated and would have at least, if not spoken to us, allowed us to come into Israel to investigate. But that wasn't to be. It took effectively, as you can read from the book, it took some 3 months or more before Israel said, no, we will not cooperate, finally. There was an exchange about it, but that was my regret. And I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake not to talk to people not to allow people in to see for themselves and to hear for themselves the stories of people on all sides.
If I can just say a word about it, I think one of the things that I've argued here is there's a whole chapter devoted to the op-ed that you wrote in the Washington Post 2 years later, in which you distanced yourself from some of the conclusions of the original report, especially the conclusion that the punishment of civilians in Gaza was a matter of intent and of Israeli policy. And while that op-ed did not win you lots of friends, those on the Israeli side kind of said too little, too late, and those who felt that that the cause of Palestinian justice should be foremost felt that you'd backed away from an important conclusion. I argue that in doing so, at least you created more space for thinking about the complexities of asymmetrical warfare and the question of what armies can or cannot do, where command responsibility lies, and that the original report maybe was, as I think you came to feel, tilted too much in a specific direction that didn't allow for a more searching opportunity to think about those things in more depth and complexity, where permissiveness rather than specific orders may have been the cause for some of the things that happened.
My name is Earl Goldman. I'm a graduate of Brandeis in the class of 1966 and have been struggling with Israel since I've spent my junior year at Hebrew U in 1964-65. And you've been one of my heroes over the years in that struggle of commitment and yet belief in social justice. And I'm a psychologist. So I look at you as a hero and look at your courage, and I want to know, what do you think made you that way? What made you be in this specific position that very few people are allowed to attain?
Well, I don't think one has a choice. I think people are brought up. Certainly, one is influenced by one's home, by one's parents and grandparents. In my case, particularly by my maternal grandfather, who I was very fortunate helped bring me up and instill standards and interest, and he taught me to play chess and to appreciate literature and so on. And in fact, he taught me to type, which was a great gift. But I think it's circumstances, it's timing. I think certainly some of the coincidences in my life, as I'm sure in your life, John, it's been one's been swept up by waves of events. In South Africa, I always grew up. My mother felt strongly against any form of racial or religious intolerance. So that was a home that David and I were brought up in. So I think that's an important part of the background. And then it's events. It was certainly my going to Witwatersrand University. As much as my parents didn't disapprove of apartheid, they didn't have friends across the colour line. I never met black South Africans in my parents' home as equals, other than as domestic workers. And when I went to university in my first week, as Dan recounts in the book, I found myself in the cafeteria lining up for food, and there was a black South African student standing behind me, and we started talking. And we had lunch together, and he told me about his life in Soweto, which was horrible to hear, a student having to go home to no lights and no water reticulation. And here I went home to a comfortable upper middle class suburb with my own library and books, and he had to study by lamp in Soweto, and that angered me, and that's an anger that stayed with me to this day. So I think it's background and events, but in the end, I don't think one has a great deal of choice.
I think if I can add, of course, I write about your family background and the influence of your mother and your grandfather. But I think one of the things I've also tried to capture about you that starts early and continues through has been your ability to connect with and listen respectfully to all kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances. I tell in here the story of the rabbi from New Haven, Shmuley Hecht, who came to one of the talks you gave shortly after the Gaza report and was unfurled a huge sign that compared you to all of the villains in Jewish history. And yet, when he wrote to you and came up to you after the event and told you of his concerns, I think the exchange went something like this. He said, well, Judge Goldstone, what if in the end all of your charges against Israel get proved wrong? And you said, well, in that case, I will rejoice. And from there, a kind of friendship of sorts emerged where you were able to kind of listen respectfully to each other, never come to agreement, in fact, but it ends up forming in a way, some part, your ability to kind of think through new ways of thinking about complicated issues. And I think your ability to do that, whether it's connecting with a victim in Gaza on the ground, or a critic of your report, or someone across a color line in South Africa, that's part of what enabled you to do much more than others might have in the same position.
Hi, my name is David Benger. I'm a graduate of Brandeis as well, class of 2014, and I'm currently a law student at Harvard Law School. Thank you so much for coming here. It's been a real pleasure to hear you talk. I have a two-pronged question. One is, as we select, or not we, but as the next prosecutor for the ICC is selected, what counsel, what advice would you give the selectors for what background they should be looking for, what qualities, et cetera, what would make a good third ICC prosecutor? And secondly, if you had an hour in the room with her or with him once they were selected, what advice would you give them about how to do the job?
Sorry, I didn't hear the second one.
The second one is, if you had an hour with the new International Criminal Court prosecutor, what would your advice be to that person?
Well, I think the first thing is transparency, consistent with not disclosing, jeopardizing investigations. I think it's very important certainly for any international court, particularly because they knew and they suspect in the eyes of many people. It's very important to build up confidence in the institution and its transparency. I think that's important. I think the second is to have standards which apply to all. And I think it's in that respect that perhaps some prosecutors have failed in having double standards and letting the politics dictate. Dan has mentioned the importance of, and so has John really, the intersection of politics and justice. I had the privilege of teaching in some of the best law schools in the United States for 14 years after I retired from our constitutional court. And I began every class on international criminal law by telling the students, if you don't understand the politics of international justice, you don't understand international justice. Because the politics is there. And you have to deal with it, you have to use it, you have to sometimes fight it, but it's there. And it's important, I think, too, and I think here, let me not go too far, because I don't like criticizing the International Criminal Court, and I like even less criticizing chief prosecutors. But I think it's crucially important to ensure that your cases are absolutely well prepared and are going to succeed. And I was very fortunate. The best prosecutors I had in the Yugoslavia tribunal were from the United States. They insisted more than prosecutors from Europe and Africa or Asia on having absolutely top-rate cast-iron cases. Because you have what appears to be a cast-iron case doesn't mean you're going to win it. You never know how witnesses disappear and witnesses turn out to be telling lies. So you can never be sure. But certainly I had the confidence because of the caliber of the people I was working with in knowing that if we issued an indictment, it was more likely they're not going to stick. They didn't all. And I said at the time, and I've said many times since, that an acquittal before any court system is proof that the court system is working, that there's justice. You judge any court system not by convictions but by acquittals. And so I'm not critical of in fact, judges are doing their work when they acquit. But something that has shocked me with the International Criminal Court, frankly, is that some cases have been thrown out at the first stage, the first hurdle of getting judges to agree that there is a case at all. And other cases have failed at the close of the prosecution case. That never happened in the Yugoslavia tribunal, certainly in my time, in the time of my 3 successors as chief prosecutors. So I think the standards have to be there and have to be maintained.
Can I ask you a quick question about this? In talking about in 1995, when the Srebrenica massacre happened, John was one of the first people on the scene there after it happened. There was a huge amount of pressure for the tribunal to do something. And you had been already investigating Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic for a number of months, but your team of prosecutors said, we're not really quite ready to issue those indictments. We're not sure that we have the real goods yet. And they were very reluctant about it. But in the wake of Srebrenica, you kind of felt like the credibility of the tribunal was on the line. And the way I describe it, you really kind of essentially sort of pushed them to and kind of overruled the prosecutor's judgment in the name of this kind of political consideration, saying we've got to do something. We've got to get these indictments out the door. Did I describe that right?
No, absolutely correct. But that's the political force wanted quick action. But no prosecutor is going to bring that action unless you've got not only sufficient evidence, but sufficient available evidence. You have to have the witnesses not only there, but willing to come and give evidence. You know, it's a huge responsibility, which you can imagine, but many people never think about. It's a terrible responsibility to issue an indictment against somebody alleging that they're a war criminal. Imagine the effect on their lives. And certainly I wouldn't, as a prosecutor, have done that without knowing that the evidence was certainly more likely, than 90% likely to stick.
Well, Karadzic and Mladic were eventually convicted. Took 2 decades, but they're in prison now.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Balkan. I was trailing Richard Goldstone by about 5 years on the student SRC at Witwatersrand University. And obviously I was aware of his major work for the many years thereafter. I wanted to ask a question of you, Richard, and also Dan. I want to bring it current to 2019. One of the interesting things about South Africa is a lot of people who've never visited there think it's just a black-white issue. But there essentially, and in fact legally, were 4 levels or 4 classes, categories: white, black, Asian, and what wasn't always understood, Cape-colored. Now, what I'm interested in 2019 is I live here, have for 50 years, and I live in a country here today with horror, frankly, at the racialism that's crept back into this country, whether you're talking about the Mexican War or whether you're talking about other issues. And I was wondering if you're both willing to step into the political arena and comment on you, Richard, living abroad, and Dan, you've been living a number of years now in Israel. Even within the Israeli society, there's a difference the way Ashkenazis treat people at times, and Sephardic Jews. So there isn't equal treatment for Ashkenazis or for Sephardic Jews vis-a-vis Ashkenazi Jews. And some of that may have to do with where they come from originally. Was it North Africa or was it Eastern Europe? And so today we see issues here in America. There's a growing racial problem, which is actually to do with Islamic phobia. And the Christian world, the Jewish world, are struggling to deal with the Islamic world. And do you have any views on that? Thank you.
Well, again, one would need a few hours to give an appropriate answer to that. But I think fundamental to it all is that we all of us fear the unknown, fear differences, judge people by one's own background, and this of course is something that has to be overcome. In South Africa, it's a big debate going on, and I have differences with close friends about the present use in South Africa of race, of what in America is called affirmative action. In South Africa, it's the converse. In the United States, you had an oppressed minority. In South Africa, we had an oppressed majority, which is now in government. Far easier for a former oppressed majority now in government to put things right than it is in the United States, where the minority, they're formerly oppressed, and a minority is fighting for rights and has to, in a way, to get handouts from the majority. But the effects of racism last for decades. The effects of apartheid are going to be alive in South Africa in 100 years' time. It takes generations to cure the terrible effects and what people suffer as a result of racial discrimination. It's true in the United States. The effects of slavery and racial discrimination are with you all right now, and that has to be faced. I firmly believe that you cannot begin to right the wrongs of racism without using race, and I'm all in favour of so-called affirmative action policies. In South Africa, where 90% of our people were forced to have bad education, were kept out of the land, how can you put things right in 1 or 2 decades? It's going to take many years, and it's difficult because some innocent people are being hurt. It's very difficult to be a white male wanting to get into a university and wanting to get into a top university in South Africa. It's a little bit easier if you're a white female because gender's become such an important issue. But it's a lot easier if you're a black male or a black female. And that's unfair because innocent people are being prejudiced. But there's really no alternative. The innocent today are paying for the sins of their ancestors. And that's difficult. And what makes it more difficult is economy. South African economy, mainly because of corruption, but not only, is going through a bad time. And the worse that times are, the more difficult it is to have affirmative action programs. So it's a very difficult issue, and I don't think one can generalize. I think one's got to deal with each situation on its own merits.
John, I think we may be coming close to the end of our time, so maybe if you don't mind, as a kind of response in a way to some of these things, and at the risk of giving away the ending of my book, I'll read the ending, just because I think it is a nice kind of tribute to what some of the things I've tried to sum up. As Richard mentioned, this book is not a hagiography. There's plenty of critique of Richard's specific actions along the way, and as I say, some judgments, maybe in private, he'll tell me more of the places he thinks I've gotten it wrong. But overall, it's one. I obviously wrote this book because I believe that that Richard's life has something to give to all of us. And so here's how I end my epilogue. Richard, having discussed some of the principles that animated his life over the previous 3 pages, I say, Richard Goldstone was, of course, more than a collection of principles. His life of courage and controlled passion offers insights into the intricacies of human character. A South African raised in the context of racism and oppression, Goldstone's choices in his personal life and on the bench demonstrated the complexities of living with integrity in an unjust society. A professional who savored the pleasures of the good life, he undertook his work in the grand belief that the material, personal, and family blessings that he enjoyed should be shared by all. A man who began his career in a world where patriarchy ruled, he gradually acquired a bedrock commitment to righting the wrongs done to women in wartime and in peace. A Jew for whom the ideal of Israel as a shining moral example burned brightly, he paid a heavy price for his efforts to hold that nation to the highest standards. A lightning rod for outrage in an era of polarized rhetoric, he stood for rights-based values and reasoned inquiry. A judge who understood the imperfections of the law, he charted a course for the future of justice. And all that, of course, is really still very much in the present tense. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Very good.